Graffiti isn't just an art form, it's a culture with its own rules, regulations, and traditions. And amongst the many traditions of the graffiti world to the outside world, one of the more controversial is racking. And for you guys that don't know, racking is stealing. And while there's many different things that graffiti writers can rack, including scribers and markers, usually when you hear people talking about racking, they're talking about racking paint. And while graffiti has been a part of human behavior for thousands of years, in the modern context of graffiti, racking has been a part of graffiti damn near the entire time. And when I talk about the modern timeline of graffiti, I'm talking about the tradition starting in the late 60s and early 70s on the East Coast, in particular in the cities of Philadelphia and New York. And since the very early days of graffiti, if you wanted your tags to be considered valid, you needed to hit them up with some rack supplies. But when it comes to why people felt like you needed to hit up with rack supplies, I can't necessarily call it. There's still plenty of people from those days that are still around, and it's better left to them to explain their mindset, but there were a couple of different things going on at that time. First and foremost, you have to think about the context that modern graffiti and hip-hop culture come from. Namely, these things come out of poverty, and they come out of very neglected, impoverished communities in big cities. By the time the mid to late 70s in New York City came around, people specialized in hitting up trains. And spray paint has always been relatively expensive, and you need a lot of it. If you're gonna hit up a whole car, if you're gonna hit up a multi-car piece, you're gonna need a lot of cans. And instead of coming out of pocket for something that you don't really have money for in the first place, you can simply just go in somewhere and clean the place out and go hit up after. But I can also say that there was a certain prestige that came along with possessing and buying hot goods. And people in the 70s and 80s wouldn't necessarily just rack paint. People would steal all kinds of stuff and sell it. And stealing non-graffiti supplies is called boosting, and boosting has very deep history in New York City as well, to the point that there's a very famous boosting crew called the Lowlifes out there. And if you want to see how prevalent and accepted boosting was, take a look at some footage of the 1977 blackout in New York City, and you're going to see all kinds of people, many of whom weren't criminals, they were regular everyday people, going out, breaking a window, and boosting some gear. And as hip-hop culture first spread throughout America and then throughout the world, this tradition of racking spread along with it. This includes spreading to San Francisco, which already had something of a graffiti scene by the late 70s. But this graffiti that we had was gang graffiti, and they played by different rules and had different traditions. But by the mid-80s, what would be considered modern graffiti popped up in San Francisco and quickly took hold and became enmeshed in the city's culture. And when I was a kid, I saw graffiti everywhere. I saw hand styles everywhere. I would see throw-ups around, and I would see people bus hopping. And the scene expanded and intensified in the early 90s when the mayor of the city, Frank Jordan, started shutting down graffiti spots like Psycho City, and people started hitting the streets in droves, spreading graffiti all throughout San Francisco. And about 4 years later, I got introduced to the world of graffiti through bus hopping and became a bus hopper myself. But did bus hoppers in the late 90s follow this same tradition of racking, and was racking paint or racking markers considered essential for your tags to be seen as valid? And I have to say, for us, especially all my friends, this wasn't the case. And there's a few different reasons why we didn't stick to the letter of the law when it came to this tradition of racking. Getting any kind of supplies was very difficult. As bus hoppers, we'd be happy to use some paint, but we were out there primarily using markers and looking to come up on markers. And there was only one place that would even sell them to us, and there was no way in hell that we're gonna go all the way out to Daly City and take a chance stealing from a place that would just sell to us. So that left going to different places like Flax or going to hardware stores and trying to come up on some paint. The security at these places would be pretty strict. And I have to say, as soon as they would see a couple of us just come up in a spot, they would follow us. They'd be damn near like a parrot, just hanging over your shoulder, watching everything you did and waiting for you to leave. But that's not to say that we didn't try to rack anyway. Sometimes it was ad hoc. We just go out and just decide, hey, let's run up in the spot real quick and see what we can get. And this process was about as haphazard as it sounds. We had no plan. We didn't go in there trying to distract people. We didn't try to go in there, cause a scene, or just ask a bunch of questions so other people could do their thing. No, we just walk up in the place, sometimes all together, all at once, and we'd be looking at stuff in a very obvious way, and the most obvious thing that we would do is try to act like we weren't stealing. So we get a lot of attention on us, and we end up coming away with nothing. And in San Francisco in the late 90s, with the exception of stores that were out there in nice neighborhoods, spray cans stayed locked up. And if we walked up to a worker in one of these stores and asked them to open up the cans so we could look stuff over, they'd ask us for our IDs. With us being 12, 13, 14 years old, there was no way in hell that they were going to open them up for us, so we knew not to even bother. And because we were like 12, 13, 14 years old, none of us had bolt cutters, none of us had any kind of equipment to go out and do something like this, so we just took our chances. I can say when we tried to be a little bit more organized, when we tried to work together, when we tried to have a plan, it didn't work either. And I talked about this incident on my TikTok, but we went to Flax one day, and from the moment that we went in there, they were honest. They could tell that we were taggers. They could tell that we were trying to come up on some markers. And in particular, I was looking to come up on some paint markers, and as soon as I saw them, I saw somebody staring at me. And we tried to draw no attention to ourselves. We tried to come in like one at a time, two at a time. We tried to button up our shirts, zip up our jackets, and act as square as possible. None of that worked. And instead, we had somebody that was a writer themselves tell us that if we didn't leave, they were gonna call the cops on us, and they asked us to please never come back. But that's not to say that we were always unsuccessful when it came to racking. However, the things that we could usually get our hands on were postage labels and muni transfers. And stealing muni transfers was something of a rite of passage for bus hoppers, and pretty much anybody that was seriously bus hopping was going to keep their eye on a bus driver, and as soon as that bus driver got off the bus for whatever reason, we were coming up on those transfers and sometimes their jackets. But when it came to almost everything else, we just faced so many difficulties that we didn't even really bother, and we just decided if you had a marker and you were able to get up, that was good enough. But you may be asking, why was security so tight in all these places? And that's because many riders in the city, especially the riders that are going out there and hitting up pieces, still follow this tradition. And considering that some of these people have been riding since the mid-80s, they'd also been going to stores and cleaning them out since the mid-80s as well. And they stole so many supplies, in particular so much paint over the years, that by the time me and my generation came along, the spot was already blown and we were gonna have to work a lot harder. So this tradition for them remained as it was and as it had been from the early days of Graff. And something that I saw on the Hi-Fi Art website in the early 2000s expresses this. Josh D, who's the owner of Hi-Fi Art, had done a profile on Gray. And this profile in particular showed a mural that Gray was working on. But Gray didn't want to be known as a dude doing legal pieces and doing murals. Similar to using non-rack paint, hitting a legal piece was considered non-valid, and a lot of writers wanted absolutely nothing to do with them. And Josh let it be known that Gray had 94 cans to use for this mural, but possibly had racked even double that in the lead up to doing the mural. And around this same time, I came to find out that people in other parts of the country also still followed this tradition of racking paint. And in the late 90s, I talked to somebody in AOL's graffiti chat room that lived in a suburban location. And I also came to understand just how easy it could be to rack some paint outside of San Francisco. This dude told me that he would just walk into a big retailer like a Target, a Walmart, and just fill up a whole shopping cart full of cans and walk right out the front door. And I remember asking him, like, dude, didn't you get chased by security? Didn't they try to stop you? And this guy said, what security? They don't have security that works there. They have somebody in their 70s standing by the door. And like many uneducated people and just children period, I came to think that how it was where I lived was the exact same everywhere else on earth. And this wasn't the case, and in many places they didn't really have issues with graffiti. There'd only be a couple of writers that were even active at a time. And if they locked up paint in a lot of places, it wasn't because of graffiti, it was because people would steal the paint and huff it. Not too long after having this conversation, I was out of the graff world and didn't really think about racking all that much. But now that I'm back in the graff world, what's my opinion on racking? When I think about racking in 2025, the first thing I think is, this is probably the easiest time in modern graffiti history to get some supplies. In the 90s, there were definitely stores that sold markers, that sold fat caps, but there wasn't as many as there are now. And especially the online outlets for graff supplies are endless. But that's not to say that you can't rack online as well, I just wouldn't recommend it. And in general, I don't recommend doing two crimes at once, and I sure as hell don't recommend doing a more serious crime so you can go do a more minor one after. And I especially wouldn't recommend stealing from stores and businesses that come from within the graff community. I'd recommend supporting them. And I sure as hell wouldn't go to Bus's store out in Las Vegas and just start stuffing my pockets. However, these kind of graffiti retailers aren't the only businesses selling graffiti supplies. And when I think of big corporations, major enterprises that move into small towns and kill off any kind of local commerce, it's really hard for me to be sympathetic. And when it comes to the question of whether a tag is valid if it's done with non-rack supplies, in my opinion at least, most tags will be considered valid. But if you are going to go out there and follow this tradition of racking, I just recommend being careful and accept the consequences when they come.